welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the works of Elliott Sober
Oh, cool.
and his book From a Biological Point of View.
I like that title.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting book.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on the essays that you picked out.
Yes,
And I'm really excited about this one because it combines a lot of different fields.
it does.
There's evolution, there's philosophy, a little bit of math thrown in there for good measure.
Yeah, he's got kind of a unique approach, I think.
He does, and I really like it because it kind of takes philosophy out of the clouds a little bit,
Yeah.
and grounds it a little bit more in things we can observe and measure.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about him, too, is he takes these philosophical problems that have been around forever
Right.
and tries to look at them in a fresh way through this biological lens.
Right, and it does give you these kind of aha moments of
Mhm.
like, oh, I've never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's what we're going to be looking for today.
I-
Is these kinds of new perspectives on some age-old questions.
Yeah, and I think there'll be some surprises along the way.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the first things that really stood out to me was Sober's take on evolutionary altruism,
Okay, yeah.
which I thought was really fascinating because, when you think about survival of the fittest.
Right, it's like, how could altruism even evolve?
Exactly. It seems like it would be the opposite of what you would expect.
Right, like it would be weeded out by natural selection, right?
Right.
You would think.
So how does he address that seeming contradiction?
Well, he kind of dismantles that misconception that Darwinism is all about individual competition.
Okay.
He argues that it's not just about the survival of the fittest individual,
Right.
but the survival of groups as well. And he uses this example of competing tribes.
Okay.
And the tribes that have these altruistic members
Mm-hmm.
actually outcompete the tribes that are just made up of purely selfish individuals.
So it's like teamwork on an evolutionary scale.
Exactly. And even though within each tribe, the selfish individuals might do a little bit better,
Oh, okay.
the group as a whole benefits from having these altruistic members.
So they end up being more successful in the long run.
Precisely.
That's really interesting. But he also makes a distinction, doesn't he, between evolutionary altruism and psychological altruism.
He does. Yeah, that's a very important point because evolutionary altruism is talking about the behavior itself.
Right.
The outcome. But psychological altruism is talking about the motivation behind it.
Okay.
And so just because the behavior is beneficial to the group doesn't necessarily mean that the individual is consciously acting selflessly.
Right. So like with parents caring for their offspring,
Yeah,
we might think of that as like, oh, that's so beautiful, it's so selfless.
right.
But it could just be that they're driven by these deep-seated instincts.
Exactly. It might not be this conscious choice to be altruistic.
Right. It's just like programmed into them.
Yeah, more like a biological imperative.
That's really fascinating. So are you saying then that like seemingly selfish motivations could actually lead to behaviors that benefit others?
That's right. And Sober talks about this idea of indirect strategies in evolution,
Okay.
where, for example, he gives this example of fruit flies needing a humid environment.
Wow.
So instead of directly evolving humidity detectors, they evolve light detectors because darkness is often correlated with humidity.
Oh, that's clever.
Right. So it's this indirect route to achieving the same outcome.
So it's kind of a workaround.
Exactly. And Sober argues that our brains might be doing something similar.
So we might think we're being selfish, but actually...
Right. Our motivations might be ultimately serving a greater good.
Wow, that's really making me think. Now, Sober doesn't shy away from tackling some of those bigger philosophical questions.
No, he doesn't.
And one that really caught my attention was his take on solipsism,
Okay.
which is, the idea that the only reality we can be sure of is our own minds.
Right. Like, how do we even know there's an external world out there?
Right? It's a very dizzying concept to try to wrap your head around.
It is.
So how does he approach that?
He argues that believing in an external world is actually more functionally advantageous.
Okay.
He uses this example of an organism forming beliefs about tigers.
Okay.
And if it only had solipsistic beliefs,
Hmm.
it would need different beliefs for each way it experiences the tiger.
Oh.
So it would need a belief for when it sees the tiger, a belief for when it sees the tiger, a belief for when it sees, dead antelope that have been killed by the tiger.
Right.
But it's all the same tiger out there.
Right. It's just experiencing it in different ways.
Exactly.
So it seems very inefficient to have all these separate beliefs
Very inefficient.
for just one thing.
Right.
So what he's saying is that believing that there's one tiger that's causing all these different experiences
Yeah, it's just more streamlined.
is a better way to navigate the world?
It is. It's what he calls informational utility.
Okay.
Having one belief for one external object
Makes sense.
allows for generalization, and it helps the organism act more effectively.
Okay, so that kind of makes solipsism a little less scary.
A little bit.
Because it's like, well, if we did believe that the only reality was our own minds,
Right.
it would be very difficult to function.
Very difficult, yeah.
So it makes sense that we've evolved to believe in an external world because
Exactly.
it helps us survive.
Right.
So we've talked about how evolution might shape our behaviors.
Yes.
But what about our honesty?
Okay.
Sober also looks at truth-telling and lying through an evolutionary lens.
He does.
And I thought that was really interesting because you would think that lying would be a really advantageous strategy in a lot of situations.
Right. And there are certainly examples in nature of deception being very beneficial, like the viceroy butterfly,
Yeah,
mimicking the poisonous monarch butterfly.
to avoid predators.
Exactly.
So it's basically an evolutionary lie
It is.
that works really well.
It does, yeah.
But how does he reconcile that with the idea that we do actually tell the truth a lot of the time?
Right. Well, he creates this model where he shows that if everyone lied all the time, it would actually become useless. Because everyone would know that everyone else is lying, and then mistrust would just become the norm.
Oh, I see.
And then truth-telling would become the advantageous strategy.
It's like a self-defeating prophecy.
It is. So his model predicts this mixed equilibrium where truth-telling and lying both exist.
It's like an arms race between deception and honesty.
That's a great way to put it.
So it's not that we each lie 50% of the time,
Right.
but that lying and trust coexist.
Exactly.
And it's kind of this constant push and pull,
It is.
shaped by the environment and the costs and benefits of each.
And the specific situation, yeah.
That's really fascinating. I mean, it makes you start to look at like everyday interactions in a whole new light.
It does.
Now, another thing that caught my eye was Sober's take on learning and prejudice. And I'm curious to get your take on this because we usually think of learning as good
Right.
and prejudice as bad.
Yes.
But he seems to be suggesting that it's not that simple.
He does, yeah.
So how does he approach that?
Well, he argues that sometimes evolution might actually favor having these a priori prejudices.
Meaning like preset beliefs.
Exactly. And he says this is especially true if something is hard to learn.
Okay.
But it's usually true
Okay.
and has very significant consequences.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so think about an innate fear of heights
Okay.
or an innate fear of snakes.
Okay.
These aren't things that we learn through careful consideration and deliberation.
We would only think about it. It's just kind of there.
They're often just ingrained instincts, right?
Right.
And that's because in certain environments,
Yeah.
those prejudices can actually be life-saving.
So it's better to just have that prejudice built in
It can be.
than to try to learn it from scratch.
Right, because if you're trying to learn it from scratch, you might make a mistake, and it might cost you your life.
So even if a prejudice might be inaccurate in some cases,
Right.
it might be a better survival strategy overall
Exactly.
than trying to learn everything from scratch.
And what's really interesting is that Sober provides this framework for understanding why certain beliefs might be better approached through learning
Okay.
and why others might be better suited for prejudice.
So he's kind of like mapping out the evolutionary logic behind different ways of forming beliefs.
Exactly. It's about weighing these different factors,
Yeah.
like the accuracy of our learning mechanisms, the importance of the belief,
Right.
and how likely it is to be true in the first place.
That's fascinating. So we've been talking about how evolution might shape our beliefs and our behaviors.
Yes.
But I'm wondering now, if our beliefs, even our moral beliefs,
Right.
are shaped by evolution,
Yeah.
does that mean they're not objectively true?
That's a big question.
That's a huge question.
Yeah,
And that's where things get really tricky.
they do.
So how does he even begin to address that?
Well, he cautions us not to jump to that conclusion.
Okay.
He says that just because we can understand why we have certain beliefs doesn't automatically tell us if those beliefs are accurate.
So even if we could trace back the evolutionary origin
Right.
of, say, a belief in fairness,
Yeah,
that doesn't necessarily mean that fairness is actually a real thing.
exactly. It doesn't settle the debate
Yeah.
on whether fairness is an objective moral principle.
Okay, so it just gives us more information.
It does.
But it doesn't give us the answer.
You're right. It doesn't give us the final verdict.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And he also uses the example of changing views on capital punishment.
He does.
So just because those changes might not be directly explained by evolution,
right,
doesn't mean that capital punishment is objectively right or wrong.
Right.
There are other factors at play as well.
Exactly. Cultural, historical, philosophical factors.
So it's like saying we evolved to have a sense of fairness, but that doesn't mean that every idea of fairness is equally valid.
Right.
We still need to reason things out.
We do.
Consider different viewpoints. Weigh the evidence.
Exactly. And I think this is where Sober's work is so relevant today.
Okay. I'm interested to hear why you say that.
Well, we're constantly bombarded with information.
We are.
Conflicting opinions, these heated debates.
It's overwhelming.
It can be very overwhelming.
Right.
And it's easy to get swept up in the emotion of it all.
It feels like everyone's claiming to have the ultimate truth.
Right.
And it's hard to sift through it all and figure out what to actually believe.
It is.
So how does Sober help us navigate that?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of critical thinking.
Okay.
He encourages us to really scrutinize the reasons behind our beliefs.
Especially the ones that we feel really strongly about.
Especially those, the ones that we're very attached to.
So it's about taking a step back.
Exactly.
And asking ourselves, why do I believe this?
Yeah.
What are the underlying assumptions? What evidence supports this?
And am I being swayed by emotional appeals or personal biases?
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in those things.
It is.
And not even realize it.
Yeah.
So he's kind of giving us this mental toolkit.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
To navigate this really complex landscape of information and belief.
It is a complex landscape.
It is.
And what's really important is that Sober doesn't say, oh, well, we're just products of our evolution, so we can't really trust our beliefs.
Right.
He acknowledges our evolutionary history, but he doesn't let it dictate our conclusions.
Okay.
He says we have this incredible capacity for reason.
So we're not just puppets of our genes.
Not at all. We can use our reason to understand the world.
That's a reassuring thought.
It is.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all.
There's hope.
There's a lot of hope, yeah.
So we can use reason to understand the world, make informed decisions,
right,
and even shape our own destinies.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing that I wanted to talk about was his analysis of the common cause principle.
Oh, yeah.
And this is something that seems very intuitive.
It does.
You know, the idea that if two things are correlated, there must be a common cause.
Right.
Seems almost obvious.
Like the rooster crowing and the sun rising.
He uses that exact example.
He does. It's a great example.
But then he shows how that principle, while it can be helpful, can also sometimes lead us astray.
It can.
So how does that work?
Well, he points out that not all correlations need a common cause.
Okay.
Sometimes there might be separate causes that just happen to coincide.
Okay.
Or the correlation might be completely coincidental.
Like that example of the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool?
Yes.
And the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in.
Exactly. There's no causal link there, just a bizarre coincidence.
Right. It's just a statistical fluke.
Yeah, but it's easy to see how someone looking at that data might think, oh, there must be some connection.
Right. Yeah.
But there isn't.
And he also brings up this idea that a common cause must screen off its effects from each other.
Yeah, that's where it gets a little bit more technical.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So screening off means that once you know the common cause, knowing about one effect doesn't give you any additional information about the other effects.
Okay, give me an example.
So if I know that a virus causes both a fever and a rash, knowing that someone has a fever doesn't tell me anything more about whether they'll also have a rash.
Okay.
Because the virus is the common cause, and it's already explaining both of those effects.
So they're independent of each other.
Exactly. They're statistically independent.
Okay, but then Sober gives examples where this doesn't seem to hold.
He does.
Even when there is a clear common cause.
Yeah, like with genotypes and phenotypes.
Right, where the parents' genes are the common cause.
Exactly.
Of both the offspring's genes and their observable traits.
Right.
But knowing the offspring's genes does tell you something about the parents' genes, right?
It does, and that challenges this idea that screening off is always necessary for a common cause explanation.
So it's more complex than we might initially think.
It is. The relationship between cause and effect can be very nuanced.
So it's a reminder to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
Yes.
Just because we see a correlation.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah, exactly. We need to think carefully about the context
Redo.
the variables involved,
Yes.
and whether there might be other explanations.
Absolutely.
So it's about being more thoughtful and nuanced
It is.
in our thinking about cause and effect.
Yes.
Just like we are with our beliefs in general.
Exactly.
And I think this connects to another key theme that runs throughout Sober's work,
Okay.
which is this idea of recognizing the limitations of our intuitive judgments.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because we often rely on these mental shortcuts.
We do. Heuristics.
Yeah, to make sense of the world.
Right. They're efficient.
They are.
But they can sometimes lead us astray.
And Sober seems to be saying that these shortcuts could actually trip us up.
They can, even in fields like evolutionary biology.
Where we have all this data.
Right, and these complex models.
Yeah, so if even in a field like that, our intuitions can lead us astray.
Yeah.
We need to be extra careful.
We do.
In areas where the evidence is less clear-cut.
Absolutely.
So it's a call to humility.
It is.
To recognize that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And that our understanding of the world is always evolving.
Always evolving, always changing.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about embracing that process of learning and discovery.
It is.
Being open to new ideas.
Yeah.
And being willing to change our minds.
Absolutely.
When the evidence demands it.
That's the heart of critical thinking.
It is.
Being open to being wrong.
Yeah. And to learning from our mistakes.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
What are some of the insights that are sticking with you?
That's a good question.
From exploring these different facets of Sober's work.
I think what resonates most with me is his insistence on the power of reason.
Okay.
Even when we're considering, our evolutionary heritage and the complexities of the world.
Yeah.
He's not saying we should give up on truth or that everything is subjective.
Right.
He's saying we need to use our reason, our critical faculties to navigate these challenges.
You strive for a deeper understanding.
Exactly.
So it's a message of hope.
It is, yeah.
Of intellectual empowerment.
Yeah, we might have biases.
We do.
Limitations.
Right.
But we also have this incredible capacity for rational thought.
And that's what allows us to tackle the big questions.
It is.
And make progress.
Yeah.
Both individually and as a society.
I agree.
Now, as we head into the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
I'm particularly interested in Sober's critique of essentialism.
Oh, yeah.
Which is this idea that things have fixed, unchanging essences. And that seems to clash with what we know about evolution.
It does.
So I'm curious to hear what he has to say about that.
Me too. That'll be interesting.
Okay, let's dive into that.
It's a really interesting concept, right? This idea of essentialism.
Yeah, it's like, like you were saying, it goes back to Aristotle.
Yeah, this idea that there's an ideal form of a thing.
The perfect cat, the perfect tree.
Exactly. And any variations we see are just imperfections, deviations from that ideal.
But then Darwin comes along and kind of shakes things up.
He really does, with his theory of evolution.
Yeah, because if species are constantly evolving and adapting,
right,
how can we even talk about fixed essences?
It really throws a wrench in the whole system, doesn't it?
It does. So how does Sober deal with that?
Well, he traces how this shift in thinking played out in biology, and he highlights the importance of what he calls population thinking.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is population thinking?
So instead of focusing on a single idealized specimen...
Right, like the perfect cat?
Exactly. Population thinking looks at the variation within a group of organisms.
Okay.
So it's less about what is the essence of a cat, and more about how do cat populations change over time.
So we're shifting our focus from the individual to the population.
Exactly.
And to the process of change.
Right. It's about looking at the dynamics, the variations.
So we're not searching for some perfect blueprint anymore.
Yeah.
We're looking at the actual messy reality of how populations evolve.
Exactly. And this allows us to see variation not as a defect, but as the raw material of evolution.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
It's what allows populations to adapt and thrive in these ever-changing environments.
So the diversity we see in nature isn't a bug.
It's a feature.
I like that. So how does this idea of population thinking actually play out?
Well, Sober uses this really interesting concept called the norm of reaction.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Can you explain it?
Sure. It describes how a single genotype,
You know the genetic makeup,
right, can actually produce a range of different phenotypes.
the observable characteristics.
Exactly, depending on the environment.
Okay, give me an example.
So imagine a plant species that grows taller in a sunny environment,
Okay.
but shorter in a shady one.
Okay.
It's the same genotype.
Same gene.
But the phenotype, how it actually looks, changes based on where it's growing.
So it's not just nature and nurture.
Right.
It's the interplay between the two.
Exactly. It's this dynamic interaction between genes and environment.
And that really challenges this essentialist notion
It does.
of a fixed inherent phenotype.
Right. It's not predetermined.
It's a product of this ongoing interaction.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So we're moving away from the static essentialist view.
For a much more dynamic and fluid understanding of life.
I like that. It's about embracing the constant process of change and adaptation.
Absolutely. That's at the heart of evolution.
So instead of these rigid blueprints,
Yeah.
we have this more messy,
Right.
more complex, but ultimately more accurate view of how the world works.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
And I'm wondering now if this applies beyond just biology.
I think it does.
Like, can we apply this kind of thinking to other areas of life as well?
I think so, because we have all these categories that we often think of as fixed and unchanging.
Like gender, race, even national identity.
Yeah, all of those.
But maybe those are actually more fluid.
I think Sober would say so.
More historically contingent than we tend to think.
Yeah, I think his work gives us this new framework for thinking about these categories.
So instead of reflecting some inherent essence,
right,
they're actually products of these complex interactions between biology, history, and culture.
Exactly.
So it's a call to embrace complexity.
It is.
To resist the urge to oversimplify and categorize.
And to be open to the fact that things are always changing.
Yeah, that things are more fluid than we might initially assume.
And I think that's one of the great strengths of Sober's work. He's not just critiquing essentialism, he's offering us this more nuanced and sophisticated way of understanding the world.
So it's not just about tearing things down, it's about building something new.
Exactly. It's about appreciating the richness and diversity of life in all its forms.
It's a message that's both intellectually stimulating and I think ethically important.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Elliott Sober's work, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listener is walking away with today?
Well, I think the importance of critical thinking is paramount.
To not just accept things at face value.
Exactly. To question your assumptions, to be open to new evidence, to be willing to change your mind.
Especially in this world of information overload and competing narrative.
It's more important than ever.
It is. And what about Sober's view of evolution?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that our evolutionary history is incredibly insightful.
But it doesn't dictate what's true or morally right?
Exactly. We have this remarkable capacity for reason, even with the biases and limitations of our evolved minds.
So we're not just slaves to our genes.
We're not. We have the power to choose, to think for ourselves, to shape our own destinies.
And lastly, what about Sober's critique of essentialism?
Well, I think it reminds us to embrace complexity, to resist that urge to oversimplify and categorize.
And to appreciate the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the world.
Exactly. Things are not always as they seem, and there's always more to learn and discover.
It's like we've gained a new set of lenses for seeing the world.
I like that.
Informed by biology, philosophy, and a deep respect for critical thinking.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And to our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge. Until next time, happy exploring.